And what we heard this morning, as well as what was alluded to in our opening panel, were elements of what's indicated in the guiding principles itself. And there's a place for every one of us as a stakeholder to use this as a benchmark for where we are with our own children, with the children that we're teaching, and with the programs that we're envisioning. And so maybe all of you are, how many of you are familiar with the guiding principles? So you can find them online. You can find them online on the Cal website, but they do include 7 strands. And I'm just going to mention them because what will resonate is what you've heard this morning, some of the themes that Magali highlighted from the opening panel, some of what we heard from our opening speakers. Also, you'll hear them resonated. Assessment and accountability, tied to what we know we're faced with in terms of NCLB and looking at where we are as educators and responding to the tremendous pressure to be able to ensure that we are producing children that are able to compete academically in English, but in our programs, the opportunity to also ensure that in assessment and accountability, we're not leaving our target language behind. And that assessment and accountability is ensured through both our benchmark assessments as well as our standardized assessments to be able to show competency in both languages. And as we heard from our speakers this morning, the importance of communicating that loudly and clearly to students in the program and assuring for parents in the program that we will give both languages the same status and the same expectation, and how is that built into what we're delivering in the K-12 spectrum. The second strand is that of curriculum, and the third is that of instruction. And we've heard several mentions of how we work with that from the elementary to the secondary perspective, and the implications for us as educators, as researchers, as parents, and having a voice in that. We heard Carla share a little bit about culturally responsive pedagogy and the opportunity to examine critically our practices. We heard, and in some of the work that we've done at the Center for Equity for English Learners, we entitled the paper, Why Aren't They Talking? Why aren't the students in our classrooms talking? We heard about the orchestration of opportunities for students to be able to practice in both languages with the expectation that it will be academic talk from the get-go. We heard James tell us a little bit about language registers, expectations, articulations, and as teachers being able to support and share that with parents as a support in our program, and looking at this idea of meta-linguistic awareness and building that in with confidence and with purpose into our programs, so that if we choose to bring in a third language, we know where it will sit. And we've talked to our students about what this knowledge of language means and how to work with that in connection with knowledge of academics and what that looks like in the K-12 spectrum as well. In terms also of curriculum and instruction, it's this idea that the guiding principles have an opportunity for us, although initially developed and meant for the elementary spectrum, currently being looked at for implications and nuances for the secondary spectrum. They give us the opportunity to think about curriculum and instruction and articulation from a horizontal perspective within grade levels and from a vertical perspective. And so some of our speakers have spoken to that as well. The last couple of strands are staff quality, which I appreciated James' comments about, program structure, which we've heard about differences in how we perceive program and what that means in terms of implications. And then there's some excellent indicators within the guiding principles that will help us look at family and community engagement and what it means to be on a minimal on the minimal portion of being able to draw that in with proficiency to a more exemplary portion. So how can we have open and candid conversations about what we're doing to draw on our family and community, looking at it again from an equitable perspective to be able to bring it to the table and refine our practices. And then how does that connect to the last strand, which is support and resources? So just having the principles and utilizing them and doing so in a strategic way from both a classroom teacher perspective, which I sat in that role. From a parent perspective, I sit in that role as well. And from a developer's perspective and a research perspective, again, this opportunity to, as stakeholders, come together to ensure that the programs that we're delivering, especially given the amount of programs that are growing and at the rate in which they're growing, remain the quality to be able to say that we can substantiate with research their facts. So this is a really incredible resource for us to ensure to come back to.
Well, thank you, Elvira. She sort of did the summary for me.
Oh, sorry.
It's great. No, that's how to do that. But yeah, I did. This is great because now that gives us a little bit more time for your questions, because I know, with the panel, we need to be interactive. So go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question.
And who you would like to address it to?
That doesn't matter.
Okay, whoever can pick it up.
Several of you did bring up, I thought this was very interesting, and Sir, you brought it up earlier as well, how you can have a kid go through K through 12 and then also through university and not ever completely achieve native speaker status. And so personally, I have several friends who, they were Japanese, they went to English education, English only education, K through 12. Many of them went to some of the top schools in the US for college. And still, within 10 minutes or within 3 minutes of talking to them, they'll make some minor grammatical errors where you'll know that they're not quite a native speaker. And I know certainly I'm not a native speaker in other languages, but since many of you have brought that up, how do you address that? What can you do?
I mean, earlier when we were in the general session out there, that was one of the things that I mentioned that really is separating that idea that it's not just the fluent English proficient, because those are the students who do tend to be completely fluent in both languages, but it's really what you're speaking to is one who, for the target language, it's their second language. And for me, what we're looking at is labeling those students as fluent bilingual proficient, and it comes down to some things we're talking about is assessment. Is really being able to assess exactly what are the needs of the students and how do we get that. And I'll talk more about this when we go to a different session, but it's really making sure that within the classroom, there's a lot more opportunity for them to use the language other than like what was said earlier about one-word utterances or a short sentence, but really that we build within the classroom itself opportunities for them to use the language, to make sure they're using the academic language, which will free up the teacher to sit around and be able to do small group instruction and things like that. I think it leads back to, first of all, assessment, making sure we can identify where are their needs and then address those.
And I would also say, when we talk about this idea of K-12 articulation and what it means to truly immerse ourselves in a language and to develop that love of language, and also to look at what develops strong literacy foundations, thinking about what we do in K-2 and the status that we give the language and the access that we have to materials in that target language, what that means in terms of how we develop a love of reading, a love of literature, and what that does also to increase our fluency so that the four domains of language work together. And if we have students who are literate regardless of the language, that's one of the things that the research has shown, that students in the 90-10 program, if we're concerned about whether or not they'll attain the second language, one of the things that we have found is that they are the ones who report loving reading more in the target language because they were immersed in that, they had the opportunity to truly develop that literacy foundation, and so then they have the potential to maintain that through wide reading, through academic reading. If they develop the love of reading, we have more potential for them to become the type of fluent speaker, reader, writer that we like in the target language. So we really need to come back to examine the instructional practices, the resources, the opportunities that we provide early on so that it will affect the long-term career of the language learner.